My name's Kaf. It is lovely to be with you here at the Pattern Store. It's lovely to be speaking to you, watching from home as well. And we are thinking about identity this morning as the last part of our series on the new normal. Has anyone seen I don't know if it's new or whether they've just started publicising it. There's a section of the government careers website where you can do a quiz and get your career suggested to you. Who's actually had a go at that? That's a lot of hands. Do you want to hear some of mine when I did my quiz? Dental hygienist. Wouldn't have chosen that one myself. Soldier. Wouldn't have chosen that one. Astronomer. Now, I grew up, and my dad, growing up, and still now, is obsessed with space. Like, he loves astronauts, he loves rockets. He will tell you all sorts of interesting facts about Mars if you ask him. So, astronomer actually wasn't too far in terms of, like, genetic predisposition. RSPA inspector. I'm on the staff here at Pattern Church, and I've got no plans to look for a new job at the moment. It's funny, isn't it? You do the quiz anyway, don't you, even if you're settled in your job. But any of those jobs would be quite a change from what I'm doing at the moment. It would be quite a different experience. And we're just thinking in this series, we've had 6 weeks of thinking about how we respond to the changes that have been happening around us. And I did wonder that maybe this questionnaire was one way of the government just saying, there's change coming, just helping us to preempt maybe even more change. I don't know whether it's always been there or whether they invented it for this season, where actually lots of people may well be changing jobs. Some of you might have already changed jobs or finished a job recently. Not all of us are working at the moment, I realise that, but our work is really easily and deeply connected to our sense of identity. What we do can so easily become part of who we are. And there's lots of other things that are core to our sense of self that might have changed recently. Our relationships might have changed, the people we're spending time with or not spending time with. Exercise, I think exercise sometimes, how we look after ourselves is sometimes really core to our sense of self. Lots of people that looks very different for at the moment. Church, for those of us who, for whom faith is really important, church looks quite different. For lots of people, that's been a real shift. And I know that many of us have felt shaken at times by the changes. I thought it had been a little while since we had any Disney pictures on a Sunday, so I've got some Disney pictures for you. These are some people from various Disney films that I think are exhibiting very well something of an identity crisis. And I think that some of us might, I certainly do, relate to them. So the first one is Mr. Incredible. Is he coming up? Here he is. Mr. Incredible was told he was not allowed to be a superhero anymore. Sounds familiar. The rules have changed. And instead, he had to work in insurance. And he was not happy about that. Actually, I think you see a real, low mood, I would call it, in Mr. Incredible. And I think some of us, some of the people that we love and know, have been feeling really sad in this season. There's a bit of an identity crisis. It brings down our mood. In Rapunzel, in Tangled, Rapunzel there's this brilliant scene where she's released from her tower. I mean, she does most of the releasing, actually, in all honesty, but Flynn Rider, helps. So she's released from her tower, having been there for nearly 18 years. And there's this glorious scene where she doesn't know what to do next. Does she go back to the tower? Does she go on to have an adventure? Does she go back to Is she happy that she's left the tower? Is she sad that she's completely confused? And I think we've seen something of that in the last few months as well. People just completely confused over what's happening, over the changes that have happened. Are we happy about these changes? Are we not happy about these changes? My favourite Disney film is Frozen. And here's Elsa at her coronation. And Elsa, just before her coronation, has been literally hiding in her bedroom for years. And then in a matter of hours, she becomes the queen. And then, to top it off, her sister gets engaged to a man that she has only just met. And that is one change too many for Elsa. The anger comes out. She blasts her icy magic all over the place. She scares everyone. I think we've seen some angry people at the moment. We've got a lot going on in politics in this country and in other countries in the world. There's a lot of anger. Now, hopefully no one's blasting people with icy magic. But we might identify with some of that wrestle, some of that kind of discombobulation from the changes that are going on. And finally, Carl in Up. Who's seen this film? Who wept at the significant change that happens to this man about 15 minutes into this film? Big bereavement. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but once you watch the first 10 minutes, you'll know what's about to happen. Big bereavement for this man, Carl. A huge loss for him. And then, one change too many, someone asks him to move house, and that's it. He's had it. He ties hundreds and thousands of balloons to his house, and he flies his house to the jungle. Unusual choice, I would say. Maybe some of us can relate to making unusual choices. Now, it's tricky, isn't it? Because sometimes brave, good choices look a lot like unusual, unwise choices. So I'm not going to judge your choices from here. But a season of change, a crisis of identity, can make us make unusual choices. And I think we're seeing some of that. Some of you might identify with some of that today. I certainly do. Throughout this series, we've been looking at a book in the New Testament. We've been looking at St. Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians. And the Thessalonians lived in Thessalonica, which is now in modern-day Greece. And St. Paul was originally a Jew, was brought up a Jew, and then later became a Christian, and then became one of the major early church planters, traveling around, telling people about Jesus, planting churches. And that's what he did in Thessalonica. He came to Thessalonica and preached initially to the Jews and then to much wider, and people became Christians and they formed a church there. Paul couldn't stay very long in Thessalonica. He'd usually stay, but he couldn't stay very long because there was rioting happened because of all the opposition that there was to Christianity at the time. So he scarpers, and then he writes them this letter to encourage them and to help them. And they're facing a tough time in Thessalonica. They're facing opposition. They're facing challenge. They're missing Paul. They're worried about what's coming in the future. There's lots of stuff about the future in 1 Thessalonians. And I would say they're in a time of crisis, possibly. And it might be easy to have a crisis of identity in that situation. But Paul tells them a number of things in this letter that helps them root their identity, not in the things around them that can change, not in the things that we might be tempted to root our identity in, like work and relationships and exercise and whatever else I said at the start of the talk. But he tells them loads of stuff that means that their identity can be rooted in God. He tells them that they are loved by God, that they are chosen by him. That's right in the first few verses of the letter. Throughout the letter, he refers a few times to God. He calls him God, our Father, our God and Father, rooting the Thessalonians in the fatherhood of God, how they're his children, how they have a relationship with God through Jesus, a close relationship. He tells them that they're his children, the children of light, children of the day. They belong to the day. They're not defined by darkness anymore. They're defined by their relationship in Jesus. And that's going to make a difference to the Thessalonians and the way that they live, because their identity is now wrapped up in God and not in things that can change. We're looking at a passage at the end of the letter today, which is quite nice for the last in the series, isn't it, to look at the passage right at the end of the book. I thought that was quite nice. And it's really a prayer for the Thessalonians. We're looking at 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 23 and 24. May God himself, the God of peace, sanctify you. Sanctify means make you holy through and through. May your whole spirit, soul, and body be kept blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. The one who calls you is faithful, and he will do it. It's such a great prayer. There's lots of good stuff for us in this. And I think there's a few things that will really help us focus on God when we're having a crisis of identity, to help us find our identity in God and not in the things around us that are changing. And he calls God the God of peace. And I think peace is like the opposite to an identity crisis. Wouldn't you like a little bit more peace? Peace in our hearts, peace in our minds. The Bible talks about a peace that we can experience even if we can't understand it, even if we don't know quite how it's happening. God is the God of peace, and when we find our identity in God, we find peace. And it's a peace which comes from being made holy. May God sanctify you, make you holy. I think holy is quite a religious word. You might have negative connotations to that word, but in the Bible, it's a good word. It means set apart. It means different. It means set apart for God, sacred. And the Bible uses it to describe God a lot, and it also uses it to describe us, God's people, because God has made us holy. It's not anything that we've done. It's something that God has done for us. Sometimes our moment of crisis actually comes from something that we've done that was wrong. It comes from the effect of sin in our life, all the stuff that gets in the way of us being on a journey with Jesus, for living for God. It might be a failure in our life. It might be a relationship that's been spoiled. It might be a frailty we have. I think illness, I would say, is it's not directly a consequence necessarily of someone's sin, but it's part of the sin, the stuff that's not right about the world. We're all experiencing the negative effects of illness at the moment, our frailty. But actually, the message of Christianity is that we are loved, wonderful humans, that we get stuff wrong, and that we can't fix it ourselves. But Jesus has made it possible for us to have peace, to have freedom from some of the stuff that weighs us down, to be holy, to be set apart. He's died for us. He's taken all that stuff that messes us up and gives us a crisis of identity. He's taken that stuff to the cross. We don't need to carry it ourselves anymore. We don't need to be letting that stuff be part of who we see ourselves. We can know freedom. We can know peace because God has made us holy. And it's not like at work where you earn your wage. It's given freely to anyone who wants to receive it. It's because of God's kindness, his grace, we can know peace. I had an interview this week with a lady called Paula Farris. We've got a picture of her here. And she's actually just written a book about finding your identity in Jesus. So if this is interesting you, go and read her book. It's marvelous. There's lots of really, really good stuff, scripture. She's an American journalist. She did well at school. She then had a successful career in journalism. And at the pinnacle of her career, she was presenting Good Morning America. And I don't really know what that equivalent that is in the UK. I guess like the one that Lorraine used to do or something. I don't know. Anyway, it's a big show in the States. She was successful. And she describes herself as being hooked on a drug called success. She says, I never made it my primary aim to love God and love others. I was too enamored with my own name, with making my way into the spotlight, with climbing the next rung on the ladder. She'd found her identity in things that were not Jesus. And then she had a series of crises, a lot actually over the course of a year. There was challenges at work, stuff was a bit tricky. She had a miscarriage, a traumatic miscarriage. She then had a freak accident where someone threw an apple at her head while she was doing a live broadcast. I mean, that's random, isn't it? She got a concussion from that, which lasted on and off for months. She then had a car accident, and she had a bad case of flu, which turned to pneumonia. And all of this stuff finally brought her to the point where she felt she maybe needed to slow down. And she actually left her job. She left her job at ABC, and she does remain a journalist now, but she's working in a way in that her career doesn't take over her whole identity. And she's doing things a bit differently. And she writes, many of us have found our identity in the wrong things. And so God uses a crisis or a series of them, in my case, to wake us up from time to time. I didn't appreciate before how rooting my identity in God, rather than being defined what I do, changes everything. And she's written a book because it's been such a significant time for her. Eugene Peterson translated this part of the verse in the Message Bible. He translated it, may God himself, the God who makes everything holy and whole, make you holy and whole, put you together, spirit, soul, and body. The peace comes from being holy. And the peace also comes from being whole, from our whole selves finding their identity in Jesus, having that like integrity of self. Spirit, soul, and body is what Paul writes. Now, Greek philosophy at the time was kind of interested in all the different parts of humans, mind and body and spirit and soul, and separating them all out and working out what they all do. And I don't think Paul is entering a philosophical debate here. He's just saying that our whole selves, we can be made whole, we can be made holy because of Jesus. Our whole selves, that's his prayer for the Thessalonians, that their whole selves. And I think sometimes we have a crisis of identity when we lose that integrity, when it feels like the different parts of our lives are moving in different directions, or we lose a sense of everything working together and making sense, being integrated. Whereas we want our whole lives, our whole selves, to be centered around Jesus. We want every part of our identity brought together in him. And Paul finishes this prayer by saying, God is faithful and he will do it. He's faithful. He's unchanging. He's not going to move. God is not affected by coronavirus. And all the other bits of our lives can come under him to find our identity. My identity is actually, and understanding that in Jesus is a huge part of my faith journey, I would say. I grew up not far from here, actually, in Gloucester, and I was really good at maths at school. I was all right at some other stuff as well. I really didn't like English and drama. I'm just going to say that now. But maths and science actually were probably my strongest subjects. And I studied, did A-levels, then I went on to uni. I went to a competitive university. It's quite hard to get into. And I studied engineering at university. And I did well there as well. I think actually getting good grades was a core part of my identity when I was growing up. Something that I still battle with slightly. And I started to see myself as an engineer. I started to find my identity at uni in being an engineer. There was quite a lot of us in my group of engineers. Actually, I'm married to someone I met who studied engineering at Cambridge, actually. You can't get away from them. There was a number of us all in our friendship group, and we were practical people. We liked to fix stuff and keep things simple and solve problems. We talked a lot about bridges and robots. We weren't afraid to talk about vector calculus in the dining room. That didn't make us necessarily very popular, but we were engineers. But we didn't write essays. We barely wrote sentences. We were engineers. And I started to see my identity, maybe even my core identity, as that. And in my last summer holiday of university, I'd finished all my engineering work experience. I didn't have to do any more engineering work experience. So I was like, well, this is probably my last summer for a long time, maybe forever, where I've got this long student summer holiday. So I'm going to give the summer to God. And I had a brilliant summer, went and stayed in a few different places in the UK, learned a lot about God, a lot about wonderful Christians who shared their story with me. And as I returned to uni to finish my engineering degree, I realized to my absolute horror that God might not be calling me to be an engineer after all. He might be calling me to be a vicar. And that was an awful, awful realization for me at that point. It didn't fit with the way I saw myself. I was good at maths. I like to fix things. I solve problems. I like to build things. And people are a lot harder to fix than bridges, it turns out. I don't know if you realize. I was terrified. I was not sure how this was going to work. I didn't like public speaking. Lord, didn't you know that I didn't like drama? I didn't write essays. I knew that vicars had to study theology. There was no way I was going to manage that. Didn't you know, Lord, I didn't like English when I was at school? I was really afraid, actually, that God might ask me to move somewhere I didn't want to move to. I had a very nice boyfriend. I had no idea how he fitted into all of this, into this, what God was sort of shaking my identity. I think I was having something of an identity crisis. And actually, I needed to reorient myself around Jesus. Kaf, who was good at maths and was good at school and getting good grades, was not my core identity. I needed to, reorient, get myself back in line with Jesus. Because the person I thought I was didn't fit with the thing that God was saying about me. Firstly, I was his. I was a child of God, and that needed to come before, likes fixing things on my list of who I am. And actually, it took me a couple of years to get used to the idea. I would say there was a lot of crying. There was a lot of praying. There was a lot of crying while praying. A lot of conversations with brilliant, brilliant, wise people. And actually, God has made me move to a few places that either I didn't want to go to or I didn't know that I wanted to go to before I moved there. I did have to do a degree in a subject that I found really hard. I had to re-identify myself with that. Little story about college, actually. I did a 3-year degree for my theology. And my third year, amazingly, it was possible for me to basically write essays about things that were other parts of my identity. So throughout my third year, I wrote an essay in recycling. It wasn't quite an essay about environmental engineering. It was like environmental theology. But it was still basically about recycling. I wrote an essay about music and theology. I wrote an essay about disability and theology. I wrote an essay about parenting and theology. I wrote an essay about child development, all these other parts of my identity. And maybe there was more to me than just an engineer. Anyway, I had this beautiful sense of God drawing all these different things into a core identity in him. Spirit, soul, and body found in him, reoriented, knowing that I'm God's child first and all the other stuff comes second. Or third or fourth or after, anyway. It only makes sense in Jesus, actually. It only makes sense, the rest of it, once you find your core identity in him. I wouldn't say I'm perfect at this identity stuff. I don't actually struggle with seeing myself as an engineer and someone who fixes things anymore. There's lots of other things that I'm tempted to put in front of Jesus as I'm thinking about who I am. Now it's stuff like my children, my home. That was challenging in lockdown, spending an awful lot of time in home. Stuff like social media, stuff on my, the scrolling on your phone. Certainly work stuff, that happens sometimes for me, not quite as much as it maybe used to. I think I'm still actually chasing achievement and success and getting things right, and when that doesn't happen, that still really knocks me when I get stuff wrong. That's still something that I'm working on with Jesus. But actually, I know now that I want my core identity to be found in Jesus. First, I'm his daughter. First, I'm loved by him. First, I am his child. And that's what's going to set me up well for change. That's what's going to set me up well for thriving throughout whatever the next season of coronavirus restrictions and who knows what else is to come. That's what's going to set me up well for thriving in the new normal. I don't believe that God sent coronavirus, but I do believe that amidst all the pain and grief and loss and many, many crisis points that you will have already experienced and we expect to have some more, God can still do good in us through it. God can still do good in us through it. And not all of us are feeling in crisis point today. Some of us in this room will be. Some of you watching at home will be. Lots of us have adjusted already. But actually, I would say that you don't need to have an identity crisis to reorientate your identity around Jesus. Don't necessarily wait for the crisis. It makes a good story in a preach, but actually, we can reorient our identity around Jesus anytime we like. We don't have to be struggling. And in fact, actually, this stuff will always creep in, won't it? There's always stuff that will creep in to get in front of Jesus in the way we see ourselves. There's never a bad time to be reoriented around Jesus. And I think the question we want to ask today is, what is currently at the center of my identity? It might be lots of different things. What am I putting my trust in? What am I putting my trust in? We all have things that creep in. They might not be bad things. It might be a huge number of good things that creep in that we're putting our trust in, that we're identifying ourselves with. It might be relationships in our lives. It might be how we care for other people, how we help other people. It might be stuff like work, like Paula Farris. It might be the things that we're good at. It might be some of those things that we do in our everyday lives that give us a sense of self. They're important and they're part of who we are, but they don't belong at the center. Jesus belongs at the center, and everything else gets integrated into what God's doing. We're going to bring ourselves to God. We're going to do that in a minute in church, but you can keep doing that in the week. We need to work on this. It might take some time. You might need to slow down, like Paula Farris. You might need to work out how to spend time with God, to cry and pray and cry while you're praying, maybe. You might want to spend time with God reading his word, reminding yourself that you are his child first. 1 Thessalonians got some of that in. There's other great stuff in the Bible that you can read. I'll come and talk to me later. I'll give you some ideas if you don't want to read 1 Thessalonians. 1 Thessalonians is a great place to start. Spend time with God's word. Spend time speaking truths over yourself so that you're reorienting yourself in Jesus. You might want some friends to walk with you along the way, friends who know who they are, and not just who they are, but whose they are. They know they belong to Jesus. They know that Jesus is the center of their identity. They know that they're God's children first. We want to pray. We want to read God's truths. We want to walk with other people so that we can reorient ourselves around Jesus. I wonder what difference it would make in your life if you truly knew that peace that only comes from God, if your whole life was integrated and centered around Jesus, able to withstand anything that the changes coming are throwing at it. I wonder what a gift we'd be to the people around us, those that we love, those that we see every day. What a blessing we'd be to them if our identity was centered around God, if we were unshakable, if we were able to withstand crisis points and even thrive because we knew that our identity was fixed. Imagine the change in Swindon. If Christians all over this town were able to testify to the difference that Jesus makes in a time of change. That even if we're struggling, even when we have mental health challenges, even when big parts of our life have big changes, even when, life does not look the way that we thought it might, that we were able to say that Jesus kept us steady. that God is faithful and he will do it, that we can have peace and hope, and we can be people who bring peace and hope to those around us. We can be part of what God's doing in Swindon when our identity is fixed in Jesus. The one who calls you is faithful, and he will do it. We can trust him. He never changes. He's not limited by lockdown. He's not affected by coronavirus. He is the God of peace who makes us holy, who sets us apart from that stuff around us. He's the one who makes us whole, brings all the different parts of our life together in him, and we can find our identity in him.